Everyone, and welcome to this installment of the Hagen History Center Spring 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Sherry, Museum Educator at the Hagen History Center. Our speaker tonight is Steve Weiser, the Executive Director of the Erie Philharmonic. His talk tonight is entitled Erie Philharmonic, A History of Discoveries from 1913 to 1953, a journey through time with images, articles, and historic recordings from the early years of one of the nation's oldest orchestras. Before I turn it over to Steve, just a few announcements from the Hagen History Center. We are currently closed to the public due to the pandemic, but we are working on completing new exhibits in our new exhibit building, as well as those in the Watson Curtsey Mansion and the Wood Morrison House on our West 6th Street campus. We plan to be open by mid-July of this year. Our staff has created many blogs and videos that are available on our website at www.eriehistory.org, and we encourage you to check those out regularly. Steve Weiser, Executive Director of the Erie Philharmonic, began his tenure with the Erie Phil in August of 2015. As a percussionist with the orchestra for 3 seasons, Mr. Weiser has helped usher in a new era for the 105-year-old organization, overseeing an entirely new staff and office relocation that saw the orchestra move into a new space during the 2015-2016 season. Weiser has firsthand knowledge of the effectiveness of a long-term model of educational outreach, having been a musician with the Philharmonic, and firmly believes the orchestra has the artistic and financial strength to administer these types of projects. Erie is well aware of the state of the arts and education in the Erie Public Schools, and is the Philharmonic's civic duty as the longest running arts organization in the region to do all this necessary to ensure students have access to the arts. Steve Weiser.
Awesome. All right, thank you, Jeff. So with that, I will share and start the presentation. All right, so tonight we're going to take a pretty fascinating journey through the history of the Erie Philharmonic, through some discoveries that we've come across in my tenure since taking over the orchestra here in 2015. And we're going to break it down into 4 different eras within this time period, sort of focusing on the 4 conductors that led the orchestra during this time period. So with that, we'll start the first generation, looking back to the beginning of symphonic music in Erie in 1913, with the orchestra under the direction of Franz Kohler. So the one thing that we noticed from this era is that there's not a whole lot of records that exist anywhere. There aren't program books, there aren't advertisements. We really have to learn about the orchestra from probably the best place everybody learned about history from this era, from the newspapers. So here you can see on the left, this is the first time ever that orchestral music is mentioned as the Erie Symphony in Erie, Pennsylvania. This was the review of a concert that happened on November 30th, 1913. So this is considered sort of the birthplace of symphonic music in Erie. But this is all we have. There are no program books, no ads. We really have to kind of read between the lines to figure out, okay, here's where the orchestra started. Where did they play? If you read the article, you can see the Colonial Theater. What did they play? And the other thing, by looking through the article here, we can see some of the music that was performed on this first concert, which led us to the first discovery in our library of this actual folio of music. This is the actual music performed on this first concert in 1913, Ballet Egyptian, but you can see that within this folder are all the actual parts that were performed on this concert back in 1913. If we wanted to play this music this coming summer or next year at the Warner Theater, we'd be able to do it because we own all of the music right here. So here's an incredible picture of that first orchestra from 1913. You can see Franz Kohler, the conductor, right there in the front. Franz Kohler was actually the concertmaster of the Pittsburgh Symphony from 1897 to 1911, before he moved up to Erie to basically found symphonic music with the Erie Symphony. And here we can see an incredible backdrop of what we believe to be the Colonial Theater from this time period. Later on that first season, the orchestra did a second concert, which was reviewed in the paper very, very successfully. And then a little bit later, a third concert happened again at the Colonial Theater. The other fun thing to notice are the details behind the details. You can see the two different newspapers that existed back then, the Erie Daily Times and the Erie Dispatch, all talking about the orchestra in that first season of 1913 and 14. We then look ahead to 1914 and 15, and we get a little more detective work where the orchestra makes the transition to the Park Opera House, which existed on North Park Row. And then we see the 1915-16 season, we learn that the orchestra only gave one concert that year. So again, we're sort of using context clues to learn as much as we can about the beginning of symphonic music. 3 concerts the first 3 seasons. And then we know that third season, there was only 1 concert in 1915-16. So we can see that the orchestra started in the Colonial Theater, which used to be on Peach Street. Ironically, where my office is in the Weiser building on 10th Street, I can actually see where this theater used to be. And I love the cyclical nature of that. We're sitting in my desk. I can literally see the exact spot where the Erie Philharmonic and the Erie Symphony had their first start. And then, like we mentioned, the year later, they moved up the street and around the corner to the Park Opera House, which used to be on North Park Row. It was then torn down and turned into the Greyhound bus terminal. And ironically, if you look at some of the pictures of the new food hall area that they're building back on North Park Row, the building looks just like this, like what it used to look back when it was the Park Opera House. But in 1916, due to World War I, this version of the Erie Symphony had to go dark. We now jump ahead a little bit, just a few years, 1920 to 1926, the next version of the Erie Symphony, and we come across another famous name in Erie history and Erie lore, the name of Henry Vincent. Now, for those of you that probably know your Erie history, Henry Vincent actually founded the Erie Playhouse a few years earlier, and then apparently he wasn't done creating music in Erie because in 1920, he reassembled the Erie Symphony to bring them back. Now, this is one of the new discoveries that was not in existence in our archives. I actually found this from a national digest called Musical America. That was sort of like basically the national newspaper for orchestral music in the early 1900s. And in this article, I found an incredible story that really shows Henry Vincent reorganizing Erie symphonic music and bringing it back in 1920. Here is an absolutely incredible image of Henry Vincent conducting this orchestra back in 1920. And again, what we start to learn from context clues is we know that this orchestra began at Academy High School, Collegiate Academy, obviously nowadays. Here you can see the orchestra doing one of our many outreach visits at Collegiate Academy. But again, I love the history to think the visit here where you see the audience and there's a piano on stage, that was from just a few years ago. It's incredible to think that almost 100 years earlier, the Erie Philharmonic was on that same stage performing for an audience. During this time period of 1920 to 1926, the orchestra then moved homes again, and they moved, ironically, right back to the Colonial Theater. And then, as only in Erie style, they then moved right back to the Park Opera House. So again, another very cyclical nature to all of this, sort of going to all the theaters that they had visited their first time around. The other thing we start to notice, again, from the newspaper articles that we were able to find and track down from this era, is that the concerts in the orchestra were receiving very, very good press in previewing each of the concerts. You can really sort of track the weeks leading up to a concert by reading the newspaper articles, where it says there's complete plans for a free concert at the Park Theater. And then even the day of the concert, you get another advertisement previewing the concert that's about to come up. But the neat thing that's a little different than what we see nowadays is not only were the concerts previewed, but each of the concerts were reviewed as well. So with every article, we're able to find that previews the concert. We were also able to find one that reviews the concert. And again, that really gives us a scope of what music was performed, the dates of the concerts, and sometimes it lists the personnel, but not frequently. We're not always sure who the personnel was in this. And again, all of the concerts had equal reviews, both in the Dispatch and in the Erie Times News. But again, with financial constraints in 1926, this version of the orchestra had to go dark for a few years. But this is where some of the detective work really started to pop up on what we were doing. We're going to come back to this article we looked at earlier from Musical America that talks about Henry Vincent reorganizing the Erie Symphony. And one thing I had always noticed between all of the articles that we had found, including this one, were references to symphony, orchestra, and philharmonic. And we all just sort of assumed that they were always talking about the same thing, because in reality, philharmonic, orchestra, and symphony can basically mean the same thing. The Erie Philharmonic, Erie Symphony, we just sort of thought that they were always talking about one group. But as I studied and looked at this article, you see a reference to an Erie Symphony, and then something labeled as the new Philharmonic Orchestra makes its first appearance. And that was really the first time that we ever noticed that, wait, were there actually two orchestras in Erie during this time period? And as we started to look back over the same facts that we had looked at before, we actually discovered something new. In 1920 specifically, during this one season, the 1920-21 season, there were actually two orchestras in Erie performing music. So now we go back and look at the same newspaper articles that I've studied probably way too long as a self-professed history nerd living in our archives. I had stared at these articles many times and never really noticed the difference. But here you see specific reference to the Erie Philharmonic and a conductor we had never heard of before, Eugene Hassner. We learned from these articles that the orchestra performed at the Central Presbyterian Church. And we actually learned that this version of the orchestra, all of the musicians were volunteers, which again, I thought was another pretty fascinating fact. And now we can compare the same newspaper articles from the same time period side by side, and they start to tell an entirely different story when you actually now view them as two orchestras. On the left, you see something referred to as the Philharmonic Orchestra. And on the right, you see something labeled as the Erie Symphony Orchestra. Note the incredible typo in the headline, but we know what they're talking about. But on the left, you see Philharmonic, and on the right, you see Symphony Orchestra. Those were actually two different orchestras. And if you look at the dates from the articles between April 18 and May 4th, we learn that each of these orchestras were giving concerts within a few weeks of each other. So at that point in time, Erie was such a supporter of symphonic music, they had two orchestras performing in pretty close succession to each other. The other thing we start to notice from the newspaper articles about the Erie Philharmonic specifically is the emerging presence of a board, people that are really kind of getting behind the scenes to start supporting the orchestra beyond just ticket sales. We see that John Deal, president of Academy High School, is a board member. And then we notice at the bottom that Otto Behrend was a board member of the orchestra, and he has an incredible quote. Otto Behrend's one of the founders of Hammermill Paper Company, but we pull out his quote, which is pretty special. So in his quote, he says, "Music is the best thing yet found to encourage everyone in work and play. An orchestra that is promoted by unselfish motives to promote music of finest educational value is an asset to the Erie community. And the Erie Philharmonic, organized for this purpose, will have the endorsement of all." You could literally encapsulate that and turn that into our mission statement as of today, and it would still hold true over and over again. The concept of unselfish motives to promote music of finest educational value, that's something we try to do each day. So I really am heartened to see that this has sort of been behind the scenes of the Erie Philharmonic for almost 100 years, which is pretty fabulous. But as we start to read through the newspaper articles, we see that this version of the Erie Philharmonic had to disband for financial reasons, same thing in that 1921 time period. So now We're up to 1931. The Erie Symphony, as we saw earlier, went from 1920 to 1926 and had to disband. Now, from this point on, beginning in 1931, under the leadership of conductor John Metcalf, we start to get tangible history of the orchestra. We get to do a little less detective work, though not as less as I would maybe like to think, but we get to actually see things that are happening from records we actually own. So in this time period, we have actually found the first program book in existence of the Erie Philharmonic, and you can see it here on the left. This is the first program book we've ever managed to find from February 7th, 1932, from the 1931-32 season. And this was considered the first season of the Erie Philharmonic Society. They sort of combined the essence of the symphony and the Philharmonic into one performing ensemble, calling it the Erie Philharmonic Society. And this is pretty much the version of the orchestra that we know today. In addition to the first program book, we also have the first roster of the orchestra back from 1931. This is the first ever printed full roster of the orchestra with a breakdown of the instruments, who was playing what, the librarians, the assistant librarians, and they actually start listing some of the patron members in the program book as well. But this is the first historical proof we have beyond newspaper articles of the orchestra and its existence. I love that we still have this. It's pretty much hermetically sealed, but we have this program to this day. We also can look through newspapers of the era to again see a picture of the orchestra. Here you can see John Metcalf and the orchestra on stage at Strong Vincent. And no longer do we have to read too much between the lines of where did the orchestra perform, because we have program books that specifically state this concert took place at Strong Vincent High School. So it makes a little bit of our history clearer because we actually have some of the tangible proof of it. But keeping our eyes to the newspaper, this is actually the first ad ever found of the Erie Philharmonic ever in print. There could be others, but this is the first one that we've ever managed to come across. Tickets were 50 cents, on sale at the door. Notice the late start time of the concert of 8:30 p.m. But I love seeing this and then put it in context of all the other history on the page you see around it. There's reference to the Palace Theater, the Penn Theater in Wesleyville, the Hippodrome, the Lawrence Hotel, all the different things you can see happening all at the same time. The Erie Philharmonic was really coming into its own and starting to have ads. So again, I really love looking back to this, again, physical proof of history of the orchestra. While the orchestra didn't have to disband during this time period, they did have to step away a little bit in 1941 due to the ongoing presence of World War II. So on the left, you see a reference to the 9th season of the orchestra, which was 1940-1941, and that tracks if you go back to the beginning of this Erie Philharmonic Society. The 9th season does make sense. You jump ahead to the next program book that we ever have, jumps to 1945-46, and all of a sudden it's the 11th season. So we knew they took a little time off because of the war, but if there's any reference to a 10th season, we've never seen or heard anything about it. We know that there was a 9th and an 11th season. So all kidding aside, if anybody's sitting on a program book somewhere that says 10th season, I'm very interested because I would love to learn sort of what happened a little bit in that gap. But we know they come back 1945 in what is considered their 11th season. And in just a fun little side note, the super famous tenor Mario Lanza was actually the opening night soloist on that November 21st concert, 1945 at Strong Vincent High School. But what we now start to learn with the orchestra is, as they've now combined the symphony with the Philharmonic to create this Erie Philharmonic Society, they've been growing a board and supporters. The orchestra was now ready to take a step forward into sort of that professional orchestra realm. And one of the biggest things they had to do to take that leap was to hire a conductor of an international sort of clout, if you will, to bring the fame needed to the Erie Philharmonic. So that led them down the path of letting go of conductor John Metcalf and hiring conductor Fritz Mahler. Fritz Mahler as a conductor was the first time the orchestra actually reached out to an artist's agency to track down a conductor. Now, Fritz Mahler, shown here on the right, might have a name that you maybe recognize, the last name Mahler. He's one of my favorite composers, probably in the pantheon of great composers is Gustav Mahler, shown here on the left. Minus the obvious connection in how they clearly look related and the glasses look related, they actually are related. We believe from records that Fritz Mahler, shown on the right, the Erie Philharmonic conductor, was a nephew of the incredibly great and famous composer Gustav Mahler. And I remember to this day, when the Erie Philharmonic was still in our old office, how excited I was when I put that together, that Fritz Mahler was actually related to Gustav Mahler, music that we're still performing to this day on the stage. Again, one of the most famous names in musical history, had a direct connection to the Erie Philharmonic conductor from 1947 to 1953 in Fritz Mahler. And Fritz Mahler brought a pedigree with him as a conductor. He had taught at Juilliard. He ran the La Scala Opera Company out of Philadelphia. He had conducted in Berlin and Amsterdam. He really did bring an international presence with him, let alone his connection with the name of Mahler. So again, now we can turn to our program books to learn more about the history. This was the first program book ever conducted with Mahler as the conductor. Again, we can see it took place at Strong Vincent. And along with that, we can see the first program that Fritz Mahler ever conducted with the orchestra, November 3rd, 1947. And what I love is the program is something we could really program today and perform on a concert very easily this year in the Warner Theater. But if you look at the program, I love that it's sort of a hodgepodge of music. There's a Beethoven symphony, there's 2 overtures, and notice the overtures are on the second half of the program. They don't even open the concert, and there are 2 of them. So I sort of love the concept of what have gone behind the programming of this. And again, notice the concert's still starting at 8:30 p.m. That means that concert's getting done at a good 11 o'clock, just for perspective purposes. And now we start getting into pictures from this era. And I remember I nearly fell out of my chair when I actually found this picture. This is a press-worthy HD picture we actually have the full print of that shows the orchestra on stage rehearsing at Strong Vincent Middle School. You can see the shell, the orchestra shell kind of open up in the back. You can see where you'd be able to go off stage on the left-hand side back to the stagehand area. And you can see a huge chorus on stage with the orchestra. So again, this totally makes something that seems so distant, so far away, very tangible, because you can see the pictures, you can see the faces of the musicians as clear as day. So the more and more I discovered in the archives, the more we really found we have a good pictorial history from this era. Here's conductor Fritz Mahler with one of our younger groups called the Film Max, which were made up of young Erie high school and college students that really, really loved classical music. And they would get together and do programs, write special program notes, do special little get-togethers in conjunction with orchestra concerts conducted by Fritz Mahler. Here we can see Mahler with anybody that maybe sort of knows the faces from the Erie's history. On the right in the front is Mahler's wife, the very famous dancer and choreographer, Pauline Kohner. But again, a snapshot of some sort of reception or house party back from 1940s, 1950s. It looks like it could be taken last week, minus the fact that it's black and white. Here we see Mahler going to see a movie, apparently, with Linkty Hess Luther, another name from Erie's past, very well connected to the Erie Philharmonic, would write program notes and stories and program books that we're able to find. But again, I love this encapsulation of history that we've been able to just discover in file folders in our office. Some of the other things we can look at with a conductor of Fritz Mahler's stature, he was able to bring soloists to the orchestra of a level never before seen. So here you can see from Mahler's second season, he was able to bring Heifetz, the violinist Heifetz, pretty much one of the most iconic musicians of all time, Jascha Heifetz. came to Erie to solo on stage at Strong Vincent High School. He signed the program book. We actually have, again, this is a real program book. We still have the copy of. And this is where some of the other histories start popping up. There's a great story that apparently when Heifetz was rehearsing with the orchestra, he got mad at the trombones, which I guess everybody does. He got mad at the trombones and told the conductor to fire the trombones on the spot, and he left the stage. So again, I can't imagine bringing in someone of this guy's stature and then having him say you have to fire the trombones. From the way the story goes, the next day, everything was smoothed over, the trombones were welcomed back, and the concert went off without a hitch, as far as we can tell. But there was something definitely happened that he was not very happy about. We also start coming across incredible annual reports and again, sort of tangible proof of what the orchestra was doing at that time. So here, annual report that shows the beautiful front of Strong Vincent High School. And then you start to look at the board and the executive committee of the orchestra at this point, and it literally is the history of Erie on one piece of paper. We're all as part of the board of this Erie Philharmonic Society, with names as Polacos, McBriar, Zern, Hurt. All of these people were involved with the Erie Philharmonic back in this time period. The other one thing I noticed is at the bottom, you see orchestra representatives, and one of them is Hillert Witt. I had the distinct pleasure of knowing Hillert when I moved to Erie and worked with the Erie Chamber Orchestra and then worked over at the Erie Philharmonic. I knew Hillert. We definitely spent time together. I knew of Hillert as a violinist. I knew of him as a person, but it's incredible to see his name this far back in the annals and the history of the orchestra. Again, I love finding discoveries like this with names you still recognize. Another thing we discovered was an actual rehearsal schedule from the orchestra from 1950. This folded up piece of paper would have existed in one of our musicians' instrument cases, in a violin case and a trumpet case. This would have been their actual rehearsal schedule, where you can see all the concerts that would have happened, all the rehearsals, all the performances, right here. And again, it's just folded up in our archives. It really makes me smile. Some more annual reports we've discovered, where you see the train yard in the back and the Erie Philharmonic Orchestra across the bottom. Again, names like the Honorable William Hurt show up as part of the orchestra, part of the chairman, T.P. Dunn. Again, sort of the names of the fabric of the history of Erie all show up on these pages. In addition to this is sort of a spread, and the inside of that annual report, it shows all the different places that the current Erie Philharmonic members at that point, where they worked in the city. So we see in the top right, Autumn Almhagan, again, an incredible name from Erie history, was one of the flute players in the orchestra, but also worked at American Sterilizer. In the bottom right, you see a picture of the trumpeter Helen Lundgren. Helen Lundgren was our principal trumpet. And ironically, it turns out she was one of the first principal trumpets that was a female ever to perform in a professional orchestra. And she performed here in Erie first, sort of rewriting the history of the trumpet a little bit. But it sees that she worked in a local dress shop. So again, these history things really connect the names of our history and putting them directly in the city. A few more just interesting stories from this time period. Here's a concert I've heard multiple stories about from this same year that Heifetz was here. The vocalist Helen Traubel came to Erie to sing. And two things you have to know about Helen Traubel: she was a vocalist, and she was very, very, very tall. And you compare that to Fritz Mahler, our conductor, who was neither of those things. He was not a singer, and he was not very, very tall. So as the story goes, when Mahler would take his glasses off and pass them to his stagehand, and Mahler would be pushed to walk on stage, he was then left a good 2 feet shorter than this soloist. So even if Mahler would have been on the podium welcoming the soloist, she basically would have been as tall as he is, standing on the floor with him on his podium. It's an image I wish I could have seen, and I've been told this story from multiple audience members who would have been there that saw this happen with how tall she was. Another connection to history we have, Margaret Truman. Good trivia question. That is Eisenhower's daughter. And at this point, she actually was pretty much a singer. She was embarking on a solo singing career, and she came here to Erie to perform with the Erie Philharmonic. She signed the program book. You can see the date of it. But the most important reason to point this out, if you look in the bottom left, it says Warner Theater. This is the earliest record we ever have of the Erie Philharmonic performing at the Warner Theater, which again is a pretty fun thing to discover. Now we're going to go through some more of the detective work we've come across that has to deal with the numbering of the seasons and how old the Erie Philharmonic officially is. So if you look here, in the pre-Mahler era, in 1937-38, that was labeled as the 7th season of the orchestra. You then jump ahead to when Fritz Mahler was the conductor, 1948, and it's only the 2nd season. So I remember when I put these two program books, and I don't know why I compared them and remembered it, but when I put the two program books next to each other, you start to do the math that, all right, something isn't lining up here. So let's kick the can down the road a little bit and see what happens. So following from that numbering, you get to the 1952-53 season, and it's the 6th season. That makes sense. Jump ahead a few years to 54-55, it's the 8th season. That definitely makes sense. But 1 year later, in 55-56, again, we're outside of the scope of our 53 time period, but this is just to make a point. In 55-56, all numbering of seasons stop. We're sort of left in the dark as to how old the Erie Philharmonic officially is. And then all of a sudden in 1962-63, the orchestra is labeled as entering its 50th season. And that's where we can really kind of look behind the scenes into what was going on, that at some point in this time period, Erie and the Erie Philharmonic decided to embrace that first concert, the first newspaper article we looked at as the official birth of symphonic music in Erie, Pennsylvania. We knew that the Erie Philharmonic Society combined what was the Erie Symphony and the Erie Philharmonic now to become this one society. And they decided to treat the first time, that first note that would ever have been heard on November 30th, 1930, as the official birthplace and birth time of symphonic music and the birth of the Erie Philharmonic as we know it today. A few more fun stories now that we'll dive into a little bit based on the national stage brought to the orchestra by the conductor Fritz Mahler. So this is probably one of my favorite stories, and it kind of took place over the course of a few years. It involves Voice of America Radio, which is such an international body that might not be what you think is a direct connection to the Erie Philharmonic. When I first started with the Erie Phil, my second day on the job, everyone was like, congratulations, you work for the Erie Philharmonic, you have to move your office building, ready, go. So it was a good sort of trial by fire with the orchestra, but it means we had to go through all of the archives in the orchestra to really figure out what to box up, what to keep, what to move, and move from there. So on the top shelf of one of the archive rooms, we came across, I discovered 4 boxes that looked just like this, and in the box was this record that you see on the left. Ironically, between the 4 boxes, there were 88 copies of the exact same record. So something seemed a little odd. Why would you have 88 copies of the same record? So I didn't think anything else about it. The orchestra moves offices to the Weiser building, and I continued my history learning of going through all the program books of the orchestra. As I'm flipping through a program book one day, I can't make this up. This actual newspaper article, this clipping you see right here, fell out of a program book. I can't make it up. It literally fell to the ground like a leaf would. You pick it up and you sort of get goosebumps as you read Erie Philharmonic to Pierce Iron Curtain. Again, that as a headline alone is astounding. And what it turns out is that the State Department, the US State Department, came to Erie on December 8th to record one of the youth concerts of the orchestra to use it as positive America propaganda about music and education through Voice of America Radio. So then, as I'm reading this newspaper article, I can sort of feel the presence of these 88 records over my shoulder on the same shelf. And I look again at the record box in which the records came in, and it was labeled as Allied Record Manufacturing. It's a very convenient title for a record company. With a little bit of digging, I was able to figure out that Allied Record Manufacturing was the primary distributor of Voice of America radio programs. So now the dots are starting to connect a little bit, connecting us and Allied and our records to Voice of America Radio. And now a couple more quick trips back through it. We go back to the Margaret Truman program book that we know the concert was on November 30th, 1950. But on the back of that program book is an advertisement for a youth concert on December 9th at Gannon Auditorium. So now you go back to this newspaper article where it says the State Department came to Erie on December 8th to record a concert on December 9th. And we can finalize the data by connecting it to the rehearsal schedule that we looked at earlier, in which you can clearly see on the bottom left corner on December 9th, indeed, this musician knew he had to be in Gannon Auditorium for a young people's concert. And as it turns out, the State Department was there to record that concert and turn it into this record that you see right here. And the best thing is we obviously have a recording of it. So we're going to listen to just about 30 seconds of this recording. So again, that's amazing to think that recording that you hear right there was performed as a youth concert, recorded by the State Department and broadcast on Voice of America Radio all across Europe. And we actually have 88 copies of that record to this day, and the records still play, which is very, very cool. One other historical sound that we'll look at before we wrap up tonight, as again, I was looking through program books and sort of living in the archives from time to time, I came across this different advertisement a few different times as well. And here are the two different versions of it. And what it basically says is not that far before the Voice of America recording, NBC also took an interest in the Erie Philharmonic, most likely because of the growing nature of the Phil, the educational programs they were doing, and the clout of music director Fritz Mahler. NBC Radio came to Erie to record a concert as part of their Pioneers of Music radio broadcast. And again, you see these two incredible ads that, again, talk about a history of something the orchestra did on NBC Radio. But because of whatever just is innately burning in me all the time, I see these ads, and all that does is open one more round of questioning. Well, if somebody recorded it from a radio, maybe it still exists. Maybe it's somewhere. So I hopped on the NBC website, found NBC archives, and started sending them emails asking, how can we get a copy of this radio program? Does it exist, and how do we find it? 6 months of silence, nothing ever came of it. I followed up a few more times and finally actually got a response from somebody. And all they said was, all of the NBC archives from a previous time have all been delivered to the Library of Congress. So maybe it's there, good luck. So sure enough, I sign on to the Library of Congress website. And if you search Erie Philharmonic on the Library of Congress and look for recordings, there is one, and it's this. If you can believe it, again, that moment when you see it pop up in the search database and it lists exactly that it was an NBC Pioneers of Music radio program. So at least I was able to track down that it existed. But getting a copy of it meant we had to get permission back from NBC archives. So I remember getting the permission, finding an email, getting this, sending it here. It was very much like Sherlock Holmes work, trying to track this down. And I remember it happened right before Christmas a few years ago. We got the official email back from the Library of Congress of this full radio program from 1950. So what you're going to hear now a little bit of is the opening of the program of this orchestra you see right here, Fritz Mahler and the Erie Philharmonic on stage at the beautiful Strong Vincent High School, actually recorded by NBC Radio. So we'll play just a little bit of the opening of the program.
We delay the start of this program to bring you a special news bulletin. From the NBC newsroom in New York, a federal jury has found Alger Hiss guilty on both counts of the perjury indictment against him. Alger Hiss found guilty. Stay tuned to your NBC station for the later news.
Good afternoon, music lovers. The National Broadcasting Company invites you to join Fritz Mahler and the Erie Philharmonic Orchestra in the third broadcast concert in this year's Pioneers of Music series, presented each Saturday at this time by the NBC University of the Air in cooperation with the University of Southern California. Each week, NBC presents an outstanding orchestra of the nation in a broadcast concert of the works of composers who were the pioneers of music, men who led in the...
So again, absolutely fabulous connection. If you look back to the first documented proof of the Erie Philharmonic from 1913 with this article, we can pull out one final quote that says, Erie Symphony Orchestra made its initial bow to the public yesterday afternoon when a program of high-class music was rendered in an exceptionally fine manner before an audience that completely filled the theater from pit to dome. And all I can leave you with is we are incredibly excited to come back and make our next bow in a newly updated, renovated Warner Theater, where we hope to do just that and completely fill this new theater with a new stage, completely fill it from pit to dome. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Again, here's my contact with any specific questions, but I'll stop sharing and we'll see if we have any questions.
Steve, I want to tell you what a fantastic talk that was. The history, the names on those programs. I even love the bluish green type on a couple of those. I noticed in one of the photographs of Fritz Mahler, they were in the Watson Curtsey Mansion, the fireplace behind them and those mosaics. It just, jumps out at you. But to think of what a wonderful art, how do I say it? What a wonderful addition to the area, to our region, to have such a fantastic orchestra that brings so much to the schools, so much to the area, and to see the history of it, it's amazing to me. It really is.
I'll never forget it as I would just sort of go through, and again, an incredible shout out to the archivists, Mary Jean and Marion, that helped keep all these things here. Like mercifully, we have the program books. We know where they are. They're organized and they're cataloged. And it's just great. I could go back on lunch, my lunch some days, and just go through year by year to learn. And that was where you'd go through each program book. And the more you dug, the more you're like, wow, I can't believe this is all here. And that's just from that time period. I love it. That's, as a musician myself, it's so much more powerful. That's Erie's story right there in those papers, in that archive.
It really is. And I know what you mean about going back through documents, and you find the connections from one thing to another and how it all comes together. And as you said, you have to be Sherlock Holmes in some cases. You have to, did this happen? And, as a historian myself, I'm not interested in mystery history. I want to find out, as a fellow teacher used to call it, mystery history. I need to know the truth. How did this relate? I'm not going to go by what, people say. I want to know what really happened. And you've done it. There is one question or two from Sarah, who's feeding us our Facebook questions.
Got it.
A comment. So much interesting material. Are you writing an article or a book?
I could certainly talk about it a whole bunch. I've never put it down to paper, but I would sure love to find a way to, because it's clearly something I'm very passionate about. And we definitely have the documenting and the proof to showcase it. Even earlier today, I made the connection on the rehearsal schedule where it actually shows the rehearsal and the performance for the Voice of America record. And it's just right there staring you in the face. So I challenge accepted. Maybe we'll check back in a year and see what happens.
I love the NBC concert with the Interrupt This program.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Don't you think of the Orson Welles and the CBS and the Halloween thing they did. We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. Martians have landed.
No,
Another question
yeah.
is, do you have names of the youth concert performers? If so, did any gain national acclaim?
We would have the exact roster of who played on that youth concert specifically, of like, because at that point that would have been a youth concert of the big Philharmonic performing for students, but we would know exactly who performed within that orchestra because it would just be the normal roster of the Erie Philharmonic at that point. So I don't know if any of our specific musicians at that point went on to national acclaim, but I know that would have been sort of the bread and butter roster, but we would know exactly to a T what orchestra members are featured on both of those recordings.
Well, great. Well, the last comment, I think is more of a comment, and I agree. Time for an Erie Philharmonic exhibit at the Hagen History Center with a smiley face. So I would encourage you to contact, as she jokes, your cousin Becky, and
Right, exactly.
be in touch with Becky Weiser as our curator, and we can be in touch with you for something like that. I mean, I think that'd be fantastic too. Talk about the growth and the arts.
The growth and the names that you see, like as they
yeah.
all start popping up, it's literally everything Erie's named for comes from some of these program books.
Well, there's no more questions. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you, Steve. And I want to thank Sarah Little, our tech support, and all of you who watched online. Join us next Wednesday, April 7th, I believe it is, at 7 p.m. when Mr. Jerry Skrupczak will give his presentation entitled When the Iron Horse Roamed the City of Erie. So please join us. Steve Weiser, again, thank you for presenting tonight. Good night, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.